So once again, I'm Arik Burakovsky. I manage the Russia and Eurasia Program here at Fletcher, and we're delighted to organize this event. And thank you for staying all the way through the day. We will have dinner after this special event. It is my honor to introduce the next speaker. Every year, we award Fletcher's U.S. Russia Relations Book Prize. And as we were planning this conference starting 6 months ago, we were trying to think of a book that would encapsulate many of the themes that the conference touches on. And I cannot think of a better book than Economic War, Ukraine and the Global Conflict Between Russia and the West by Maximilian Hess, which was published last year in 2023. The U.S. Russia Relations Book Prize recognizes an outstanding nonfiction book on historical or contemporary foreign policy discourse pertaining to the past or present of U.S. Russia relations. It is part of the U.S. Russia Relations Initiative at Fletcher, which has been going on now for 6-7 years, and sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the global sponsor of our conference. And we're delighted to award Max the 5th annual U.S. Russia Relations Book Prize. It is a book on the economic warfare between Russia and the West and its implications for finance, energy, capital controls, relations between the West and China, global power dynamics, and so on and so forth. It's a fascinating book. And Max, I will go ahead and introduce you. He is the founder of N. Metena Advisory, a London-based political risk firm specializing in insurance markets, sovereign debt, and sanctions. He is a Central Asia Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and an Associate Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Max, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
You.
Oh.
So now I will turn it over to Max for some brief remarks about the book, and then we'll have a conversation with Chris Miller, Professor of International History here at the Fletcher School.
Great. Well, firstly, thank you all so much for toughing it out until now. And thank you so much to Fletcher, Eric, and Chris for choosing Economic War as the winner of this prize. I have to give particular thanks to Chris because my sort of move from just writing about these things for hedge funds and insurance clients alike came about a decade ago now, almost, from Chris. I had been writing about Ukraine's restructuring after 2014 and Russia's role in it, which I'll get back to in a moment. And Chris said, oh, this is really interesting. You should write about this for FPRI. So that gave me the opportunity to start writing about these things in a slightly more considered manner as well. But I really enjoyed all of the panels today, have so many more questions and look forward to following up. You know, the tragedy is, of course, you could write a whole other book on what's happened in just the last year. But for those of you, if you haven't read the book yet, what I would say is, you know, I think the key difference in where I view these things and the discussion based on what we've just had today is really most of this conversation begins around this economic war starting in 2022. And I don't think that's true. I think it started in 2012 or 2013. And I'll give you why those are the two starting dates. In 2012, the U.S. passed the first Magnitsky Act, a move heavily lobbied for by Bill Browder, who had run a hedge fund based in Russia, who, of course, his lawyer was, in defending himself against that, was horribly mistreated and ultimately likely murdered in prison. And Browder, who's now based in the UK, but had come to the US and lobbied very heavily in Congress for the removal of, during the passage of the removal of the final sanctions on Russia under the Jackson-Vanik Amendment for this new sanctions policy going after human rights sanctions. I certainly think human rights sanctions are the right kind of thing to do. I'm not saying Browder wasn't right in pursuing that policy. Essentially, he was going after imposing the same kinds of costs on the Russian officials who were involved in that kleptocratic looting of his business and murder of his lawyer by going after their financial assets and borrowing them from the United States. But Putin gave a very strong reaction to this that was almost entirely unremarked on at the time. And he said, if we let them, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but he said, if we let them slap us in the face like this without responding, they'll keep on doing it for forever. Again, I'm not endorsing his position on that, but I do think how little attention it had in the wider U.S.-Russian narrative at the time is a mistake that we made and that we failed to understand. For the 2013 starting point, though, and this is where I think things really escalated, we have to remember, firstly, that the first use of sanctions and trade instruments in this conflict was actually used by the Putin government to pressure the Yanukovych administration, right? There were sanctions introduced on Russian-Ukrainian trade back in 2013, but the one that really escalated it from just sort of a trade squabble or, a glorified version of some of the geoeconomic tensions we see between countries all the time, is that it really took into the larger international economic order. And I think economy and war have always been tied together. In fact, the name of my company, Enmetena Advisory, which is an ancient Mesopotamian name, so there's no way to mispronounce Enmetena because nobody has any idea. But King Enmetena was the king of Lagash, a city-state in ancient Mesopotamia, that had the first ever recorded interstate war in taking over the city-state of Ummah. The casus belli that he cited on the Enmetena cone, there's one copy in Yale's library and another in the Louvre in Paris, was that Ummah had failed to pay its debts from a previous conflict. And I think everything is better said by hip-hop artists, and Wu-Tang once said, "Cash rules everything around me," and then they did later a Chappelle Show skit where they said, "Cash rules everything around me except when other asset classes provide higher risk-adjusted yield." And the real way that we need to think about the dollar system is not just around the dollar, but also around the role of U.S. treasuries that play in that system. And the first thing I want to say on that is that it is entirely a mistake that we ended up in this U.S.-led international economic order. The things that really created it were Nixon's decision to, leave the gold standards, the Plaza and the Louvre Accords, particularly in the 80s, and then European development of the euro-dollar market in the 1970s, which really changed the orthodoxy around whether we should have open or closed capital controls in the economist's trilemma. Of course, we have a very learned audience here, so I won't go into all of those issues now, but of course, if you have questions about them, I'm happy to talk about them. The real sort of argument that I make is that this is a war about that U.S.-led international economic order. And the first thing I would say to that is that every single time I hear the term rules-based international order, especially from political officials, I want to go crazy. There is no such thing as the rules-based international economic order, and we do ourselves a huge disservice by talking about that. And now I know that we live in an era where particularly universities are very complex around this issue, but of course there's another state that operates an apartheid system and that horribly misjudges its neighbors. And for the, respect of my own cousins who live there, you may think I'm talking about Israel, but actually I'm not. I'm talking about Azerbaijan, which is, of course, our key partner in getting out of a lot of these issues and has really positioned itself as gas there. We have put sanctions on one Azeri official over assaulting journalists. That same journalist who was assaulted is now a very large spokesperson for the Azeri conflict and the great successes that they had in pushing the ethnic Armenians out of there. So, I think we should completely abandon the term rules-based international order because there are no rules. It is a U.S.-led international economic order. Now, of course, I am a critic of a lot of U.S. foreign policy. I was someone who was born into this world of caring about these things after the horrible follies of the Iraq War, but perhaps with age and less wisdom, I've come to realize that this U.S.-led international economic order has tremendous benefits for the globe and is really based not only on the U.S., but also our partnership. And Russia in 2013, in addition to launching this trade war with Ukraine, launched a direct assault on that U.S.-led international economic order by messing messing with the terms of Ukraine's bonds and getting the Yanukovych administration to agree this bailout that was supposed to be $15 billion, only $3 billion were ultimately sold, that blurred Russia's position as an official or a private sector creditor. And going back to my quote from Wu-Tang, it's really about those capital systems and those finances there that matter. And essentially, this was Russia trying to say, we are stepping in and we are breaking those restructuring processes between the two, and we will heavily politicize them going forward. The scope of international sovereign debt restructurings and the politicizations thereof is a little bit outside of the scope of this talk. But if, simply said, this is a step that no country had taken in quite that way before, is something that, of course, we now talk about all the time around China and its Belt and Road, and one where the IMF changed its rules in response. So getting back to the International Economic Order in 2015, after Ukraine was bailed out, in part by the U.S. guaranteeing some of its bond programs, to nullify the threat that Russia had put in there, the IMF changed its rules on lending in arrears to lending the countries in arrears to other official sector creditors, allowing Ukraine's private debt restructuring to proceed and essentially defanging this Russian threat. Dmitry Medvedev, the Russian alcoholic, former president and prime minister, at the time gave a very important statement that, again, there's not a single mention of in a single Western news outlet. You have to go to Russian media to find it. He said, this is the opening of Pandora's box of international finance. Now, I disagree with him slightly because Russia, of course, started this in 2013, but the fact that there wasn't a single bit of English coverage around it really quite shocked me. And I went to the IMF meetings the next year and I asked them about this. And of course, they denied that there was any politics involved in any of this whatsoever. And then I said, well, I mean, you are a UN institution, but I did notice that you only put out the announcement putting out this rule change in Russian and English. So, it's quite clear who the intended audience was rather than all of the official working languages of the UN. So, that fight has really been ongoing since before 2013, really escalated, of course, in 2022, where I'm sure a lot more discussions will be had about this tomorrow. But the key move was not the nuclear option of, as it was called at the time, of targeting Russia's SWIFT networks, but really going after Russia's, war chest, the sovereign, balance sheet strategy that they built up, in particular, the freezing of over $300 million in reserves held in abroad, no longer largely in the U.S., but primarily in Europe. That's the bulk of that is the 200 billion sitting at Euroclear that is now being used to help finance these things. And what I want to say is, we can talk a lot about where sanctions work and where sanctions don't work. And it's a great honor to be sitting here with Professor Dresner. I almost named one of the chapters in the book, how I learned to stop worrying and love Dr. Dresner because of the Chris said it was a good idea, but I thought it was too much of an open plea. And, really about sanctions working primarily on allies and his great work in the sanctions paradox. Versus where they work now. And, where I would really push back is we've seen, and I get this from financial journalists all the time, now we all agree that, these actions and sanctions are threats to this US dollar system. Actually, the academic research that's come out in the last year has proven that the impact on, dollar reserves and dollars' role in global trade, and the reserves are much more important, but anyway, has been approximately zero from all of this, including from the freezing of those Russian assets and now from the harnessing of them. And there are certain ways that that system is so important and so structurally fundamental. There's a reason why China, our key adversary, and Japan, our arguably key partner out in Asia, are the #1 and #2 holders of US treasuries. And it's not because they love us in equal measures, but because of the systematic way that this war is structured and that system is structured. I think we really need to talk about that and focus on that. And that's why, there's a lot of talk, and I think particularly the financial press, but also many of us in the policy sphere, view Nabiullina and the Russian central bankers as these, officials, Western educated. Nabiullina was winning awards for her defense of the Russian financial system from Euromoney and the FT and others in the aftermath of 2014. But they are as guilty in this economic war as a Russian general on the battlefield. The Grigori Yudin, the Russian sociologist, perhaps put it better when he was asked about Nabiullina being a war criminal. And he said, well, Albert Speer was a war criminal. Wasn't he? Ignoring the fact that actually the Nazi central bank official was found not guilty in the Nuremberg trials after. And I think, is a lesson that we should keep in mind for these things. But before I ramble on for too long to kind of, bring it together, the points that I want to make around all this is that, like I said, we're not losing on that international economic order front, but I fear that we fail to take the right lessons and that we may lose in the future. And Putin cares a lot more about this than he does about other things. I just ran through the numbers to double check they were still accurate, because he's obviously given some rather ridiculous speeches in recent days, including the change of Russia's nuclear doctrine yesterday. But if you go on the Kremlin website and you go through every one of Putin's speeches, statements, media conferences, and the like, since the 24th of February, 2022, Putin has spoken about NATO 29 times. He's spoken about the dollar system 31 times. This is what he cares about far more. Putin's doctoral thesis, published in 1996, I believe, almost certainly plagiarized, also mentions his hatred for the dollar system. This is a really long-running thread there. The key to understand, and that's why Putin puts so much more efforts into BRICS and the like than anyone else. Now, we can talk in questions about the structural weaknesses of BRICS and the fact that it's not even a real organization, and that the BRICS Development Bank and related ones have themselves frozen their own loans into Russia because of how intertwined this system is. But Russia is the key voice in pushing for that. Now, for those of you with the background in international political economy, this may seem rather obvious, but the real weakness in the BRICS system, including the countries that have joined it recently, which again has no cost to them, Egypt, UAE, or let's stick on the core ones: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Right? South Africa, sadly, is an economic basket case, so we're going to leave them out of discussion for this points here. Brazil, Russia, India, China, all massive surplus earning countries. For them to build up an alternative currency system, what they need are cash ruling everything around them, but yields providing higher risk adjusted awards. What they need is a deficit market that they can go and recycle those surpluses into. That is why the U.S.-European alliance is so important. We are the only two deficit markets large enough to sustain that kind of partnership. That's why Russia is so keen about driving Europe and the United States apart. And we really need to understand this better in our discussions here. And going back to some of the discussions earlier about us choosing sanctions policies that had relatively little cost, at least for the United States, is of course many of the policies that we chose had huge costs for Europe. They're at the core of Germany's economic malaise today. I'm not saying we haven't respected those in the past, right? That was the difference between sectoral sanctions on Gazprom and Rosneft back in 2014. That's been a key issue, however, that I think has failed to get enough attention since this economic war at least blew up into the level that everybody had to pay attention to it. We also have to look at some of those alliances in other countries. So one of the chapters in my book focuses on Pakistan, which had done the entirely right strategy of signing long-term LNG contracts, but had failed to include break clauses in there for when the prices spiked. So Pakistan, which went through a huge economic mess in 2022 and is now on its second IMF bailout since then, had to eventually, they settled, but got in huge lawsuits with the Qataris, with the international commodities trading firms, who canceled their contracts because they could sell them to larger powers there. Now, U.S. influence over Pakistani politics is quite significant. We can, of course, there was the big change in government with Imran Khan being ousted, but I went and spoke about the book in Pakistan in January, and the finance minister at the time told me very clearly, oh no, this was a real transactionalism deal. We got that IMF bailout in 2022 because we agreed to give, lots of ammunition to go to Ukraine. I wouldn't be surprised after the latest when they've gone there. So, we are very good at this transactionalism sometimes, but, covering it in this rules-based nonsense, I think, really hurts us, and we really fail to understand how pivotal Europe is to that relationship. And that's where I think the real focus has to be going forward, and ensuring that we don't allow breaking of that essentially capital markets alliance that exists between the two. The one other area that I'll just the last two areas that I'll finish with, that just talking about, key areas of this discussion, and sadly I have to fly to a wedding tonight, but I really look forward to catching up with the economics and energy sector panel tomorrow morning, is LNG is going to be the gas market, is going to be the key market of the future, right? Now, when you look at a lot of emerging markets, hydrocarbon power is the way people like me look at them, as their break-even oil price. In 10 years, it's just going to be a break-even gas price. Certainly now that's, a key way we should already look at it. And that development of global gas markets is a huge difference between 2014 and today, right? In 2014, or even I was living in Switzerland in 2007, the Russians cut off the gas to Ukraine, a lot of Europe. It had impacts downstream on the gas prices there. But now, because of the development of the global LNG market, we live in a world where gas price differentials in Europe, or LNG strikes in Australia, can cause heating prices to go up here. Now, LNG has, of course, been a key response to Russia's invasion, and Germany certainly wouldn't have been able to weather the economic pain of 2022 and is in the manner that it did without that global LNG market and the success there. But thinking about LNG as a national security priority, including in how the U.S. can increase its influence there, is going to be really significant. And the most important story going on right now is not around in my view, the Russian shadow fleet, but really around their attempts to step up this LNG fleet, getting around those sanctions. It looks like we're having some success there. The first ship from Arctic 2 LNG has made it just yesterday all the way across the Arctic route to Eastern Russia, but it's had to pump its gas into a floating gas storage unit, FGSU, where it will probably get mixed, and then they'll try to sell it on. But that's where I think, if we're going to hit the Chinese with secondary sanctions violations, it really needs to be around natural gas and being very clear that and we've had big successes there, right? Just this week, Novatek, the big Russian LNG firm, dominates that market more than Gazprom, announced that it was suspending work on its Obsky and Murmansk LNG plants because of all the issues that it has faced with Arctic 2 LNG. And then the last one, because it was touched on briefly earlier, cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies, and in particular stable coins, are a huge threat to U.S. influence over this international economic order. Yes, there's an argument to be made for CBDCs to help advance that, but the stable coins as they exist now, like Tether, run by a bunch of charlatans out of the Bahamas, who have failed to honor their previous agreements with U.S. regulatory and prosecutorial officials, are of course the key money laundering system for getting money out of Russia and many other markets. And there was some discussion earlier today, which is the sort of point I'll finish on, about this talk around whether we need to try to attract more capital outside of Russia, right? For more capital flight. I think that gets it a little wrong, because one of the key impacts of sanctions is that while a dollar, whether you hold it here in Timbuktu, digitally or physically, is fungible with one another, a dollar, as soon as it crosses the physical or digital border into Russia, automatically loses some of its value compared to a dollar outside of that system. We see Andriy Melnichenko, a very powerful Russian oligarch, had kept his money outside of Russia, set it all up through Dubai, and the Russian government actually brought charges against him last year until he agreed to repatriate all that cash there. So, really, I think it's about actually trying to. The longer capital is frozen and trapped in Russia, the larger that discount goes and emerges. And then the final, sort of point to wrap is that even if there is success in this war tomorrow and Russia's army collapses, which of course I hope for, but I don't, base my assumptions off of, the ramifications of this economic war are going to go on for a really long time. The future of those frozen Russian assets, what happens to them in the future, with the U.S. trading with the Enemy Act against Japan and the assets that were frozen out of that, the final legal judgments from the Supreme Court around where some of those funds should go didn't come until 1969. 24 years after the end of the Second World War. And so there's going to be a lot of repercussions from that through the legal system, through global trade, through global capital markets, that I think really need to be at the core of how we think about this European Western alliance and strengthening that going forward. Because, the war in Ukraine, we need to acknowledge, is a war of attrition, and so is this economic war. It is also a war of attrition. But as Alina said so very well earlier, sanctions are not some perfect tool, but imagine that we existed without them. And it is one in which I would comfortably say that we're really winning. But our greatest threats come from within, from driving apart that alliance between European and U.S. capital and capital markets, and from our own politicians going and lobbying for a lot of crypto nonsense. So with that, I'll wrap up. I'll turn over to Chris for some of his questions, and then I hope to take some questions from all of you.
Well, thank you very much. From ancient Mesopotamia through sovereign debt restrictions to the Wu-Tang Clan, I was not at all surprised, but nevertheless very impressed with. Yes, indeed, yes, indeed. Well, I'd like to pick up where you left off, and I'll ask a couple questions just to get the conversation going, but then would welcome your interjections as well. So to start, you ended with an optimistic note, I guess, that it's a financial war of attrition, but we're winning. Right now, a number of governments are undergoing sanctions reviews. The UK government is, the US will, I'm sure, once the new president and Congress are in place. Which part of the package of economic warfare measures do you think are working well? Which ones do you think are working less well? What would you tweak if you were sanctions czar for the day?
Sure. Well, so the first thing that I would do is I think ways need to be found to get over some of the European hesitancy, speaking of European markets, around secondary sanctions, right? So last year, the EU brought in its own anti-circumvention measures in the 11 sanctions package. To this day, the list of companies listed under that is 0. The UK can do a lot more on insurance markets, and I really enjoyed the presentation earlier and hope to follow up around it, my proposal that I've put to them is essentially bringing in what I would call a market access ban, so they don't have to use the term secondary sanctions. Basically, because the UK is not just a dominant insurance market, but reinsurance, and my favorite word, retrocession, the reinsurance of reinsurance is Bermuda, which also comes under that UK legal framework, or at least UK sanctions framework. So, that's what I would do really on the sort of wider alliance. The key points around trade sanctions and the like. And again, I don't want to say that the financial sector is perfect. Of course, there was the C4ADS, where Alan Maggard, who spoke on a previous panel, is affiliated. Their great report that came out earlier this week, that got amplified by the FT and a lot of others, about HSBC and JP Morgan having processed transactions for others. But it's been over 15 years since there were the first multi-billion-dollar fines for sanctions violations in the financial sector industry. Right? They have sanctions teams not as profit centers, but to mitigate their potential costs there. They are not perfect, but there is a genuine self-policing mechanism there. And I think we need to adapt from that to incentivize technology owners of both of the IP as well as producers and distributors, that they also have, and that will include some kind of very large fines on. I think we should start with U.S. companies to make it clear that it should be there, but also is really important in thinking about these with our partner states, right? I've done a lot of work in Georgia and Kazakhstan and elsewhere I know we don't use the former Soviet, people don't like to use the former Soviet space. I don't like to use Eurasia, but in the wider region as well. And in terms of sort of the state capacity and institutes there, and of course the amount of sort of matryoshka doll networks this stuff all works through, I think it's a little bit misguided to say, oh, look at how bad Kazakhstan is for these giant white goods, washing machines and the like getting shipped through there. When that report came out in the New York Times, I was like, this is an amazing sanction success. Are you telling me the Russians are having to take apart washing machines to get chips? Like, that's great. So we really need to focus on bringing it more within our own systems and our companies that can frankly afford these and have far more capacity to do it, and can pay better rates to the compliance individuals who they hire and invest in their expertise more than I worry the public sector is willing to. The other part on that I would really say, of course, is one of the ones that doesn't get talked about is, of course, the Southeast Asian chip manufacturing industry, right? Malaysia, Philippines, these are key exports there. that's the big, great unknown to me. How many guys are there with backpacks flying from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing and then on to Russia or the like, and just invading these kind of controls really systematically? So whether it be through adapting blockchain technologies or others that give us better oversight over supply systems, I think we need to take the lessons that have worked from sanctions compliance in the financial sector and apply those to the trade and intellectual property sectors. And of course, with so many chips, as you've of course written so wonderfully about, and other technologies, with China becoming increasingly under this perspective, we can think about those policies in terms of increasing effectiveness on technology controls around China, not just Russia.
So one of the topics that hasn't come up hardly at all today is oligarchs, which if we'd had this conference in Washington, we'd have only talked about oligarchs, which I think is a striking, excuse me, a striking difference. But I'd love to put the question to you of where the Russian oligarchic elite or business elite, whatever phrase you want to use, is today in this context of financial interconnection. And ask you to draw on your expertise and your own social networks to help us understand what the typical Russian oligarch or minigarch is thinking today as they try to interact with this new world of sanctions on both sides.
Yeah, so for a little context for those of you, Chris, personally speaking, my interest in Russia really began from the fact that I was educated in Switzerland, and when I looked at the first day for a table at lunch to sit down at, I thought that the loud, obnoxious table of guys throwing things around in the back were Americans, and it turned out that they were Russians, Uzbeks, Georgians, Kazakhs, Ukrainians, some of whom were the children of big oligarchs, and some of whom have very fascinating stories. Actually, the yacht on the cover of the book is called the Grand Russalina II, and that is the property of my friend Dmitry Ruslanovich Goryukhin, whose father, Ruslan Goryukhin, is the one who built the bridge to Crimea, and is strangely still unsanctioned. But we can talk more about this if you have questions. It's really been quite interesting because there is a little bit of a rally around the flag effect with some of those, but at the same time they don't want to be seen guilty. Even Abramovich's daughter was posting that at the beginning of the war, before disappearing from social media, probably a parental diktat. I certainly don't ascribe to the view that the Russian top-level oligarchs or even those right below them can have any kind of political influence in Russia. They're too discredited from the 90s at the top level, and they're too disorganized, and even those in the sort of middle class who are very involved in some, or have in the past been involved in Khodorkovsky's networks and others, spend far too much time arguing with each other. So I don't think that they should be a real focus of our policy. There have been some arguments made that individual sanctions don't work. They are a very effective way of going after, in my view, networks of companies by going after the top node and then trying to come after them, right? Why go for Medusa's many heads when you can hit the body? But we are seeing some of them increasingly frustrated with Western rhetoric, willing to go back. And of course, because I am speaking in some cases around friends who've been scattered around the world, others who can't leave Russia even though they have tremendous property elsewhere. In terms of setting our policy, as you were saying, in Washington would probably be so important. I broadly think we need to set them aside and acknowledge they're not going to be individuals who determine where this economic war and other war goes. But there are important lessons to learn there, nonetheless, from when we consider sanctions programs elsewhere for countries where the business elite does have far more influence over the politics. And when I'm talking about these oligarchs and business elite, I'm really talking about the 90s ones, right? I'm leaving aside the Siloviki and those who really owe their fortunes entirely to Putin or who worked with him in the 1990s and then became millionaires and went on to become billionaires and the like.
Well, I have some more questions. Let me see if there's some from the audience as well. Great.
Thank you. It's so interesting to hear your perspectives on these things. And so much of it makes sense. I think one question that some oil traders will have is whether LNG really is going to have the depth of liquidity and the breadth of the spot market to overtake oil in 10 years' time. perhaps further along the way, but 10 years seems pretty quickly for a commodity that has that small of a spot market. But that aside, I wanted to come back to Wu-Tang Clan because that's
I was hoping someone would go there.
I found a way. And this whole idea of risk-adjusted returns, you talked about the dollar being acceptable reserve currency. It's got the large offshore surplus because people are willing to accept it. And they're willing, China and Japan, they're all willing to invest in it. And they invest in it because they feel as though it's a relatively good risk-adjusted return, a store of value because it's protected. Now, you might say it's protected by the U.S. Navy and it's all about American leadership. But having spent 20 years working with countries from around the world, many of their companies around the world, especially in Russia, trying to get onto the London Stock Exchange or do M&A in London. And it's all about rules. It's all about transparency, compliance, corporate governance, disclosures. And they would often say, come on, I don't have to do that. You can surely call somebody. And it was constantly a battle back and forth about saying, no, we just can't bend the rules. This is the city takeover code, like it or lump it. If you want to play, you got to comply by the rules. Now, there are other places where they broke the rules, but do we too quickly or glibly dispense with the idea of rules actually being an important competitive advantage of the Western system?
I'll answer the second question and then the first question. Look, of course, you get a fair hearing, British court system or in a U.S. court system, and that's why the sovereign debt in particular is structured under English law or New York law because others don't want to. And those are export industries, right? The Astana International Financial Center in Kazakhstan is staffed by British judges. Dubai, arbitration institutes have them too. There's a whole separate threat of China setting up its own bilateral investment treaties and arbitration institutes that is perhaps a bit out of the scope of this conversation, but I think is a key thing going against them. In terms of when I talk about the rules-based order, I mean in terms of our policy setting on an international perspective rather than domestically. But even there domestically, look, ENRC was Eurasian National Resources Corporation, a Kazakh company. There's lots of controversial things, was listed in London for 7 years, 2006 to 2013, delisted, moved to Luxembourg. That hasn't had any real meaningful impact on its business. Even after Tom Burgess wrote a wonderful book, a former FT, now Guardian journalist, called Kleptopia, in which he very strongly implied that they may have been behind the murder of two of their former own employees on U.S. territory. Now the company's been renamed ERG. They continue to operate totally fine. They've actually secured judgments in the UK just at the beginning of this month against the Serious Fraud Office and against the whistleblower who went after them. There's lots of issues in the UK system actually being based around rules. And the takeover codes and the like, but we also had lords on boards in the UK, right? This phenomenon of finding some toff with a country mansion he can't afford to heat, who would in exchange for his fuel bill sit on a Russian corporation. And that's something where I see huge hypocrisy with that too. So I'll give one example, which is a company owned by a group of sanctioned Russian oligarchs through a holding company called Letter One, German Khan, Michael Friedman, a few others. They own a company called VEON, right? Which is a Dutch listed group of telecoms holding companies. And they own Kyivstar, Ukraine's largest mobile phone company. What have they done? They took Lord Vasey, a former foreign minister, and Brandon Lewis, a serving Conservative MP, and paid them £150,000 at least a whack. Vasey probably got paid more because he then took off he suspended his membership in the House of Lords, so he didn't have to disclose it anymore. And what did they do with Kyivstar? They took Mike Pompeo and threw him on the board. This is complete reputation washing. And now we have these, ostensibly private individuals from their government connections who have quietly been handing themselves some shares in the company, which can't distribute any of its profits outside. So, does that strike me as very rules-based order? No, I've been trying to get the Washington Post to cover this for a while too, but it's just an incredible amount of hypocrisy, I think. And so, yes, in terms of our legal systems and domestic policies, but we don't apply rules, internationally. The Azeri example is perhaps less controversial than the Israeli one, so I'll stick on that. But as to your question, with regards to the LNG and the spot market, I mean, the rate of 10 years ago in 2014, if you had told me that we would have as globalized LNG prices as we did today, I would have thought it was too early. The rate at which LNG is coming online, not only in the US, but in key markets, Angola, Mozambique, the developments in Qatar, Australia, markets will build out that spot market very heavily. And, I really see it as the key geopolitical pool going forward and to have influence over. Will it be the exact same as the oil market in 10 years? No. But will Angola's ability to pay its debts in 2031 depend far more on their gas production than their oil production, or the fact that they left OPEC last year, which didn't make a lot of news, but I think is important? I think so.
So I have a follow-up on rules, then I'll bring in Marguerite after that. So you've argued, and I think it's true, that some amount of our influence comes from the fact that other countries have no choice but to invest in our financial markets. And in countries where power is concentrated and money is concentrated in the hands of potentially dubious individuals, does that not imply that we have to accept a bit of dubious money if we're going to have investment coming from countries with dubious political systems? Is there not a fundamental trade-off there, or do you think that it's solely a question of our rules not being
So, I mean,
enforced?
this is exactly why I think we throw out the talk of rule. We accept money from dubious countries all the time, right? I mean, again, I'm going to go back to the Azerbaijan example, right? They're probably the most effective spenders of lobbying money in the US. We're working very hard on finding new ways to get more Azeri gas into Europe, even as they do, threaten new war against Armenia, and of course pushed out 150,000 people. These things are all, I don't want to oversimplify that. There were obviously horrors that went on the other side of the conflict in the 1990s there as well, for which Armenian officials who were involved weren't held to account until they were kicked out in revolution in 2018. So yes, when it comes to kleptocracy, sanctions, and the like, I think if we stop talking about them primarily as being we're going to defend human rights by having this global Magnitsky Act and we're going to apply it justly and evenly everywhere, that hypocrisy sees a lot of things. And I'll dip into the Israel argument here a little bit, right? Obviously, there's huge other issues when it comes to dealing with key Middle Eastern countries. The future of AI, future of their money. These are also non-democratic states run by small families who control incredible amounts of money in the UAE. But yeah, our hypocrisy around a lot of these issues makes it harder for us to build public support and helps Russia further some of those narratives that it does. And you see that in, again, this is a very niche example, but one that I think really matters, right? All the countries in Central and Western Africa that are like, although I'm a huge fan of the CFA franc. I think it's one of the best things that came out of colonialism. Maybe the only good thing. Huge fan. But all these countries that are involved in it now get, these huge, Russian narratives because they're very susceptible to it and because we fall into this hypocrisy. And so it's very easy to make the argument that the French treasury is controlling these for horrible things rather than, hey, this is lowering your own default risk and giving, foreign investors comfort in coming in there. Again, I'm not against defending human rights, but I think if we were more honest that yes, we do take dodgy money sometimes because frankly we need Azerbaijan, and Saudi Arabia is the great example there, right? Look at Biden promising to treat MBS as an autocrat and I forget what the exact term that he used, pariah, yeah, in the 2020 campaign to then fist bumping him. And the reality is what would have far more success than any of our debates around capital market policies, right, in terms of defeating or accelerating Russia's defeat in this economic war, would be getting Saudi Arabia to restart its oil price war with Russia.
Which might have happened this morning.
Yeah, which may have happened this
Just to be
morning.
clear.
So let's keep our fingers crossed. I deal with trader clients, and I'm not. So I prognosticating oil prices forward even next week is right. But I'm very surprised by that report that came out in the FT. If anyone isn't aware about Saudi Arabia saying it's willing to accept oil prices for longer, right? But I mean, hey, like, does Saudi Arabia do a lot of bad things? And do I worry about MBS eventually turning into the future Putin who like blows up the Middle East? I really do. But right now, I think frankly it was the right decision to make, because Putin is not only leading this horrible war that's killing more Europeans since the Second World War, but also is this huge threat to the international economic order. So I totally understand and support the decision. But if you talk about everything in the rules-based order and human rights, then yeah, you look like a giant hypocrite.
Margaret.
Yes, so first I wanted to say that I was really glad that you raised up the question of LNG and that you have a whole chapter on Pakistan, because one thing that we did not discuss in the panel on Western adaptations today is that one of those adaptations, moving to LNG and finally getting in place infrastructure for large scale imports, it had a huge impact on international markets, and especially in the global south and especially in Pakistan. So that's really good. But I would have two questions for you. One is, I'd love to hear a little bit about how do you decide what cases to bring into the book, chapters and so on. And secondly, this is kind of maybe a little bit of a fringe question. Does your experience tell us something about what may happen to those arbitration courts that are not really like, legal courts, but are arbitration?
Investor settlement
Yes,
dispute.
yes.
Yeah.
As somebody who has been working on energy, the Stockholm arbitration was always there. And how are some of the changes that we are seeing affecting that?
Sure. So, in terms of how the examples that I chose, it's not a great answer, but I've got a friend who writes airport bestsellers and stuff like that, business books. He wrote a very good book called 10% Entrepreneur. He actually, when he was doing his MBA down the road, he's the guy who invented the term FOMO. So I called him for advice, and he said, listen, tell all the stories that you like to talk about at dinner parties, and write them down and do the crazy person thing and put them in Post-it notes and find a structure that kind of works there. So, that was basically it until finding a way that I could kind of create what I thought would at least hopefully be a narrative that flowed throughout the book. And, I wanted it to be read by people who read The Economist or Wall Street Journal, but aren't necessarily interested in regional studies or the like. So, I mean, yes, there were examples that, I left out, obviously there's a lot there, but I thought in particular telling the Pakistan story, and also changing the story of Eurasia and Central Asia and the Caucasus. So, the longest chapter is on that, and really the focus is on how little new fighting there was between 2014 and 2022, and how much the spread was elsewhere. And I just thought those were two stories that challenged the sort of common narrative and therefore, really deserve to be told. On sort of, international arbitrations, I mean, the one that really interests me, and I was talking to Chris about this a little bit earlier, is 2 months ago, I think in July, Uniper, which is the German company that got bailed out by the German state, got handed a $13 billion award by the Stockholm Arbitration Court. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but from the legal sort of people that I speak to, they would have a relatively easy job going to a court in Brussels and getting to attach that money against the frozen Russian funds that are sat there. Of course, Germany wants to re-IPO Uniper, and under German law, it seems they have to do something about this before. And so that's a huge. I've been trying to get a good answer from the German government about what their strategy is there, and I have yet to get one. I'm not sure that they actually have a clear idea of what they want to do. Russia has responded to that by setting up its own arbitration institutes. They had done a 1 billion more, 14.5 billion in favor of Gazprom against Uniper, because the sanctions meant that certain Russian lawyers couldn't go there. And, under the Manhattan Convention, it's pretty clear to me, again, from the lawyers that I speak to, no foreign court is going to recognize this rinky-dink Russian arbitration institute. But, what I would say, and this is going back to, again, thinking about, how we ended up here by mistake in this US-led system with Bretton Woods and PASA and Louvre Accords, it's when I look at China and these things, they seem to have a much better strategy for the really long run, right? These bilateral investment treaties, things that literally nobody reads. You can get all of them in UNCTAD, by the way, for those of you who are interested. Their own arbitration institutes. I mean, like in an ideal world, I wouldn't have arbitration institutes really be a thing. I'd have these, done elsewhere, but that's not up to me, and that's sort of where we are. In terms of like giant, huge systemic issues around arbitration risk, like I don't know if I see one right now, other than this very long-term threat from how China's building that into their own loan mechanisms and how that could affect, future sovereign debt restructurings, because that's what I'm interested in particular. I would love to research more specifically on that topic, but right now I think the big one, and the one that, especially if we're talking about global repercussions of Russia-West economic warfare, that needs a lot more focus is that Stockholm case, Uniper Gazprom.
So really enjoying these comments. I have a question that I haven't really gotten a good answer to, and I'm sort of curious, which is, as one of the themes of this conference is reminding everyone that, back in the day, the Cold War was all about economic statecraft. That the United States organized a strategic embargo with the Soviet Union. It was organized through COCOM. It wasn't a treaty organization, but there was definitely a multilateral structure, a pretty well-organized one, to try to deal with this. I guess my question, and it lives on in the form of the Wassenaar Agreement now, but I guess my question is, why aren't we seeing the creation of those kinds of multilateral structures now?
That's a big question. I think there's a lack of trust to get around it, right? There's huge uncertainty still, of course, about the U.S. and our policy, and it could be in 2 months' time that our level of interest in these things changes hugely, significantly. The other that I see is, really that the Euro-Atlantic alliance as we know it, and that, at least was able to help bridge a lot of these things, bring in other countries, is under points of huge strain. And that is something that, leaving aside the Trump risk, is going to continue to remain the case from politics within those countries.
But isn't that the whole point of setting up these structures? I mean, obviously you can't set them up unless there's agreement, but one of the functions of them is precisely to create a mechanism to ameliorate these kinds of disputes.
Oh, I mean, 100% I would be in favor of setting these up, right? But I think, getting the German body politic to agree on that, or I mean, even the UK, to agree on any kind of new, multilateral organizations is just politically unrealistic. And I wish it weren't so. I mean, especially Germany, and, I'm half German and has made some ungodly political decisions, in my view, in the last 2 years that I frankly don't understand, but because of the reality of German voters, and that's very different from how we discuss these things from a policy-making point of view, and it makes me like reading Plato's Republic a lot more. Yeah.
We have a pair of questions, perhaps. We'll go 1, 2.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You mentioned the UAE a couple times, and I wanted to hear more about it. This week, Sheikh Mohammed came to the White House. First time the president of the UAE ever stepped foot in the Oval Office. It seemed like a very friendly meeting. But at the same time, a lot of critics, criticize the UAE for their role in the Sudan war, and also on the stuff that we're talking about today. If you talk to people in Dubai, you hear about how Russian money are propping up the entire Dubai property market. And some people might say, it's not just about it being an autocratic family that controls trillions of dollars. It's also activities that seem to undermine U.S. interests in important ways, more so than probably the Saudis. But at the same time, the U.S. leadership seem much more comfortable using pressure against Saudi Arabia publicly. They'll condemn the Saudi royal family without really too much reluctance. But you never really hear that with the UAE. And so I want to hear your assessment about this relationship, what's really going on there. I mean, is it that the skilled diplomats are able to influence American political leaders so much more successfully? Is it that the oil markets of the last 2 years have become so important to U.S. thinking? Is it that the U.S. doesn't really mind having a little bit of a clearinghouse for Russia in an important port city? Or is it that the U.S. are actually using pressure against them in ways that aren't public? Or what do you think is really going on there?
Let's get one more question just so we can pair it up, please.
Hi, Rylan Pitts, a grad student at Fletcher. I think there's I wonder if there's a reason why the U.S. and its partners would not want to push too hard to degrade the Russian economy, and the reason there being that Russia and China are not natural allies. When there was a border dispute after the Soviet Union fell, or before the Soviet Union fell, Nixon went and created a huge economic partnership and opened up the Chinese market. So I wonder if weakening the Russian economy too much creates increased dependencies on China that in fact limit Russia's ability to be a natural counterweight and counterbalance of regions that are of importance to the US.
Yeah, all right, I'll try to answer both of those questions. Starting firstly with the UAE, I'm no Arabist, I don't claim any regional expertise down there. What I would say is, the UAE is a core country in a lot of other partners and a lot of other nodes of trade, and not just looking at it from a US point of view, but right, for Europe, one of their biggest issues is all the trade that comes out of the UAE's 50 plus, free trade zones and the lack of good customs data. And that's a huge issue. The success of Emirati diplomats is something that I hope to read a really good book about sometime soon. Yusuf Al-Otaiba is probably the most influential ambassador in DC. His brother was fundamental to the 1MDB scandal and everything that blew up there, and seemed to have no costs for him whatsoever. That's probably much more at an interpersonal relationship level that you really need to be in the room and have a much better local understanding to get behind. Broadly, I'm not such a critic of our approach to the UAE. Earlier I was just defending how we've sort of softened things with regard to Saudi Arabia, which I think poses potentially much larger regional destabilization risks. But I do think we have to be kind of more transactional with them and say, hey, if you want to have Sam Altman build $600 billion worth of chips in your country and whatever, then you got to work with us to make sure that those aren't going to go to Chinese things and others. And I lack the local enough understanding of history and things there. But what I would say is, when I speak to Emirati diplomats and representatives, right, like, of course, viewing things out of their shoes and their history so much is the UK role in the Trucal states, and then what came out of that. So my impression is that they do value their Western partnership far more than they do those others. But right, like Dubai is, maybe people don't know, but right, Dubai almost went bankrupt after the global financial crisis in 2008. The world's tallest building, Burj Al Khalifa, is named after the then ruler of Abu Dhabi, which is the neighboring emir, because Abu Dhabi had to bail out Dubai. There were a bunch of Emirati real estate companies and the like that almost went. Like, Dubai is really very much like Miami, and that it is a city built on bubble after bubble after bubble, and then finding ways to address that. But I think they recognize that their current system is not going to be sustained if we do get to that post hydrocarbons future, which I don't see as the next 10 years. But I do think the Emiratis think about this in a much longer time horizon, right? And I've had Emirati diplomats, sort of tell me things to that effect sometimes. So I guess I kind of got to take them at their word for it. But yeah, so I don't know if I have a huge criticism there, but I think being more honest about the transactionalism and putting that forward rather than this rule stuff, I think would help. In terms of like, does the US or the West broadly want like the Russian economy to collapse entirely? No, I don't think that that's, our sort of core aim here, right? It's much more about, Putin being atop of it, right? I think the West would be perfectly happy to have a thriving Russian economy that was, run by someone less inclined to challenge that US-led international economic order. And that's why we were so supportive of Yeltsin and other efforts in the 1990s. Plus, of course, the fact that lots of Westerners made huge amounts of money there. But again, particularly, this goes back to some of the comments earlier, like, yeah, is there a reason why the oil price, could OFAC put more Russian shadow fleet tankers on its list at a far faster rate and without the same legal justification issues that European sanctions authorities worry about? Yeah, they could. But I think it is really about trying to manage that, oil price risk, right? Because one of the things that I've been talking about that hopefully now, that we're a month and a half less out from the election, but, is what I'm thinking about when it comes to that Saudi news is like, if you're Putin, right? I think a huge decision making. I mean, from what we've gotten from Politico's reporting and others, the U.S. was convinced by October of 2021 that Russia was going to launch a full-scale invasion and that Putin was going to change his mind about that. I think that Putin in part chose the timing of early February 2021 when this so-called whiplash effect of inflation out of supply chains was really hitting, because he saw the inflationary pressures as the key way to break that Western alliance. I think Putin slightly miscalculated there, and that he didn't take into account, the normalistic factors and some of the, what constructivists would talk about, right? And that, like, if Putin had launched this war on the other side of the Black Sea, nobody would have cared. The fact that Ukraine is in Europe really mattered, and so I worry about Georgia. But we saw it in Kazakhstan in January, right? We were all sitting on our TV screens waiting for the Russian army to go into Ukraine, and it's, of course, it has lots of its own complicated dynamics around regime stability and the like, and what was actually going on. But the Russian army did go into Kazakhstan in January, and what was the global reaction? Zero. And now, I'm not saying that the right move would have been to go and react there, but, so I do think there is a key constructivist factor to Putin mistiming that, but I do think he really chose that timing to try to, harness the inflation pressures that were already coming about. And so when it comes to the situation that we're in now, I still worry that Putin will try to bring in some kind of major oil supply shock before the election to try to help Trump.
I know we've got to get Max off to the airport on time, so we're going to make sure we end on time. Let me grab one final round of questions, and then I'll let Max try to address them all together. Hugo, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, two very quick things. Firstly, I sympathize with your frustration with the concept of the rules-based international system, though I reserve my ire for the liberal international order instead, which is
we can beat both of them up.
There's a distinction between the two. My question is, if you don't like that pitch, what is our pitch? We have to have some kind of affirmative vision for a model and a system of global political economy. And if it's not saying we're rules-based, I think it probably still is saying we're rules-based to a certain low level, actually, which is why I don't make that my out. But if that's not our pitch, what's our pitch? Is it just we make you richer? And then my second question is, I agree with you on the overwhelming importance of the transatlantic alliance. When we move away from Russia and think about Taiwan scenarios, that makes me very, very, very scared, because the chances of getting alignment on those issues are so much harder. I'd be curious for your thoughts.
Wait, grab some more questions. Sorry.
Right. This morning we've heard Peter Carl, who was talking basically the following story, that countries were becoming a little bit concerned about too much American influence on them and too much ability of the US to squeeze their arms. So some countries might be wanting to hedge their bets. Some of you are strongly advocating that the US should actively discourage or scare countries of, say, having things with Russian mirror payment system or getting too close to China and so on. In the past, the way it was, US was offering value to the countries, and in exchange for that value, US was asking the countries to follow US foreign policy. Now it sounds like that US scares the countries to stay within US system. And more and strongly so, it looks like US effectively forces other countries, like it or not, to follow US foreign policy, to do things that might be in the US interest, not necessarily in the interest of those countries, and effectively just follow the policy that's been defined by the people who are not elected by those people. So there's more and more of the thing that life's political course of many people is defined in rather non-democratic way. Do you see there might be some threats in this? And don't you see that, or see or not, if people could become seriously unhappy because of this, and how this whole situation could unravel? Or these concerns are unfounded?
Let's see if there's one or two more questions. All right, we're good. Those are our final questions. Then.
Cool. I'll try to answer them in reverse order. Right. I mean, I still remember when on the eve of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Jacques Chirac and Gerhard Schröder jumped on a plane to Moscow and had a giant, photo session with Vladimir Putin, talking about how bad the the US was. So yes, the US makes mistakes all the time, threaten our own alliances, and which is why I think when looking at the world through this economic and capital-based system, we can see a lot more of the importance of our European partners. And in some ways, I think Germany should get rid of the Schwarze Null, and there should be much larger European debt. But that if we're going to keep partnering with them on these things, we have to listen far more to other countries' concerns, and that is a very important part that we should have of our own political debate here, right? Which is that again, rehark my point, right? We often fall back on. It just is the way it is that the US is this key international node, and the dollar system exists in the way it does, rather than understanding the kind of mistakes and it was not, Nixon thought it would weaken the dollar to pull it out, right, of Bretton Woods. I do think we need to have a far more honest discussion, particularly with our European partners around a lot of those things. Yes, the US will always be the loudest voice on them, and we will probably elect people at various points in my lifetime who things that I really disagree with, foreign policy wise. But then to transfer to Hugo's question earlier, in terms of what is our alternative vision? I agree with you that just saying the U.S.-led international economic order is not a great alternative vision. If we do it with our key partners and bring in this sort of larger foreign policy voice or some kind of multilateral institution working together with Japan and European countries and the like, I would love that. I'm not sure that I see it. I don't myself have that, alternate narrative. I really hope that we get one, and maybe I'll think of one at some point, but I haven't gotten there yet. I would push back a little on the, the narrative is what is so necessary for, it to be successful, right? I'm not so sure that anybody, his name, Mark Mazauer wrote a great book, Columbia University professor, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, about governing the world, about different visions for international institutional governance. And, the thing that I sort of came away with it was like, oh, a lot of these ideas were fun and interesting, but not a single one of them ever had buy-in from, more than 1 or 2 major powers. Still got better. I am an eternal optimist. I'm not sure we have the answer there. In terms of Taiwan and what I worry about, again, this is getting outside of my area of feigned expertise. But what I would say is, look, I think the riskiest point in Taiwan is going to be January this year, right? The presidential transition or whatever. I've kind of been arguing, and I deal with, clients who do trade finance and stuff. Like right now, if you want to do trade finance in Taiwan, you can get paid what you get paid for a country with like a BB credit rating, and Taiwan's AAA. The market perception of the Taiwanese risk, I think, is far higher than it actually is. But if I were sitting here advising the PLA, what I would tell them is, look, the U.S. policy vacuum that's going to exist in January, that's your time to go, because whether it be, these sort of drone swarm air defenses that are being developed in California, or the laser technologies that are being developed as missile defenses in South Korea, that those could really make some kind of amphibious invasion far harder going forward. As to Taiwan's role in the global economy, and particularly its chips and the like going forward, there's a great book called Chip War, and I turn you to its author for far more informed insights on that.
Well, Max, thank you so much for spending time sharing your vision of how the world works. Thank you for this fantastic book, which has not only earned a prize, but also inspired the conference with a title that has been plagiarized by us for the title of this conference. So I hope that alone is, I think, evidence of the respect.
Well, let's test this rule system and see if I get a lawsuit against it.
Don't test that, please. But before we test that, actually, please join me in thanking Max for.
Thank you.